talking about canopy management yield estimation, and in all honesty, it's a little bit late to talk about time-wise. Here we are, just after the 4th of July. So we're just going to kind of focus on things that we maybe still can do. And I think the tricky thing with, if you do a web search about canopy management and that kind of stuff for grapevines, a lot of it is basically focused on VSP, midwire cordon, trained vines where the shoots are being orientated upwards, or it's juice grapes. And so we're in a little bit different situation where the majority, not everyone, but the majority of our vines in our region are high wire cordon trained vines, but yet they're not juice grapes. And so there's not a ton of great info out there, and as time allows, I'm trying to rectify that, and so forth. But I show this picture in the start of a lot of these presentations just because to me this is a super well managed, very productive vineyard where we have a nice amount of fruit exposure, not too much, and an excellent yield. And we got dappled sunlight in there. And so something like this is kind of our goal eventually. And so what we're going to talk about today are, first of all, we need to replace missing parts and the cost it has on yields, and that's something we can do in the summer. Shoot positioning and combing, talk briefly about leaf pulling, and then end on yield estimation. And if there's questions, like Sarah mentioned, you can save them at the end. And so, a lot of our vineyards are starting to look like this, where we have a lot of vigor in, a lot of people refer to as the yoke or head area, and we have decrease in vigor on the edges. And part of that may be trunk disease buildup. Part of that's just the cultivars we grow. Frontenac in particular tends to do this, where it has a lot of vigor there. And so, we have an uneven canopy quite often to begin with, even just based on our cultivars. But secondly, because of our trunk diseases and all that kind of stuff, we're starting to see this more and more where we got vigor in this head or yoke region and not towards the ends. And ultimately, what we start to see is gaps in our canopy and gaps in our trellis. And I always reiterate that the trellis is the most expensive part of our vineyard after the cost of land. If you've pressed out posts and metal and the labor to put them all in, our ungrafted plants are relatively cheap compared to the cost of the trellis. And so we want a full trellis. And so there was a study done in New York, quite a while ago, that was posted on, the Cornell website, talking about what is the cost of all these gaps in our canopy. You can do a web search to find the full article. I'm just going to share some of their information and kind of correlate it to an Iowa or Midwest situation. And what they found is, through a vineyard survey, and they went out and they actually measured in vineyards, the hybrid vineyards in their area, and I would say we're probably a little more vigorous and higher yielding than we have currently in Iowa. They had about 10% was the gaps in the trellis. Some were higher and some were less than that. And so if we kind of do the math, that let's say, if our goal is to get 5 tons per acre and we're getting $1,200 a ton, if we have all these gaps in the trellis, say 10%, and filling the trellis is our goal, because that is our goal. We want a full trellis of vines and fruit. You're losing basically $600 per acre by not replacing those plant parts. Now, obviously, the cost of labor to fix all this, but I just want to kind of reiterate that it's okay to have some minor gaps between vines. It's actually kind of nice, but if we see large gaps between vines, that is costing us money 100%, because we're not filling that with fruit. And so the thing we got to keep in mind, though, this is assuming your vines can actually fill the trellis, and that's not the case in all situations. So, I would really prioritize replacing missing plant parts. But before I do that, I really think we got to answer some hard questions. And the first is, am I going to prioritize replacing missing parts or even missing vines on a vineyard that maybe we need to hit a reset button on? A lot of our vineyards are hitting 20, 25 years old, something like that. And maybe the vigor dictates it's time to start over. And so before you invest that time and money in retrellising, redoing vines, you got to ask the question, is the long-term outcome for this, or outlook on this vineyard, positive? And if so, by all means, do that work. If not, maybe you start to rethink if a reset button is required. Same thing with missing vines. A lot of people like to replace missing vines, and that makes a lot of sense if the vineyard is vigorous and productive. But if you're not in that situation, again, I'd ask the question, is it worth it to replace vines if the long-term outlook isn't great? And you got to have outstanding weed management for young vines for this to be successful, because it's tough. If you're doing a replant situation where maybe 10% of your vines are dead and you're replacing them, it's really hard to manage those 10% of those vines within a vineyard that's in full production. And so, again, you need outstanding weed control to make that work, replacing missing vines. Again, ask those questions. First of all, is this vineyard in a situation where we can rehab it? And if not, maybe you replant on a tighter spacing in the future. So canopy management, we don't want a situation like on the far right side where, the shoots are crazy vigorous and draping all over the floor, or the shoots are, 20 feet long. We also don't want a situation on the far left-hand side where, our shoots are only a foot or two long. We want shoots that are a full trellis of shoots that are, 5-6 feet long, filling the trellis. And that's tough to achieve, but it's less work to do the middle situation than the far right. If you have super, super vigorous vines, it's less work for you to leave more crop on them and to balance out the canopy more. And so if you're in the situation on the far right, you maybe need to consider, maybe I just need to leave a little more crop on these plants to tame them down a little bit. So kind of getting back to the canopy management situation, we often have congested areas, and ideally our whole cordon would be full of these, but oftentimes that's not the case. And so, our goal is kind of bring order to chaos a little bit. And if we add leaves onto these things, the one on the left-hand side, we got some places on the tips of the cordons that has some decent fruit exposure, but not in the middle. And our goal is to kind of get that more evened out when we do some canopy management. If you have low vigor vines, you may not need to do any canopy management because the shoots aren't really long enough to cause a lot of shade or justify the time of canopy management. So, but the hope is that we have moderately vigorous vines that are producing a heavy crop load, and then it makes sense to put time into canopy management. So a lot of people will talk about the time involved with canopy management, and 100% it does take time. I would say combing grapevines should take less than a minute per vine. If it's taking you longer than that, you're taking too long. And so, especially for hand pruning and hand harvesting, combing really can make hand harvesting and hand pruning way more efficient than if you don't comb these vines. So yeah, it's time spent. Again, it should be less than a minute per vine, but it can save you time hand harvesting and hand pruning, or even machine pruning, because the machine doesn't handle shoots growing horizontally as well as it does shoots vertically. So again, our goal is to kind of comb downward. And sunburn's a real risk. We need to get this done soon if we're going to do it. And a week like last week would not be the ideal time to do it because sunburn is a real issue. And waiting to do this at the end of July is not going to be very advantageous to you, and because it's got limited efficacy the later you do it, and B, sunburn is a risk. It's not something you can put on the calendar to do, because last week, if you did it, you'd probably get considerable sunburn on that fruit given the heat that we had. Here's a vine. It's about the ideal time to do it. Shoots like 3 feet long, and we basically just go in there, comb downwards. If there's a few oddball shoots, you can pull them off. And I've heard people say, well, what's the point? Because wind will just move them back to where they were. And I personally don't experience that in the places where I comb. There might be a few shoots that reorientate, but once these shoots are this long, 3 feet, some of these are longer, usually the weight of the shoots, the wind's going to push them under, not over. And so, this took maybe 30 seconds to do this or something like that. And it's tough to get ideal timing on every variety, but if you're going to do one canopy managed practice for high wire cordon, I would suggest you comb these vines. So here's the La Crescent vineyard, and you can't see the fruit very well. We're maybe a month before harvest in this particular picture, something like that. And literally with just the removal of one shoot or combing of this one very vigorous shoot here with lots of laterals, suddenly we can now see the fruit. And some people will suggest that leaf pulling is a better option, and I'll talk about that here in just a little bit, but I debate that quite a bit, because how do you figure out what leaves to remove when shoots are growing horizontally? Where do you start and stop with leaf removal? So to me, combing these vines, shoot position, whatever you're going to call it, if you're only going to do one canopy management practice, this is the one that makes the most economic sense, and I think has the biggest rate of return, so to speak, on it's going to get the sunlight into the buds that are very fruitful as well. This is anecdotal information. This is not a hard and fast comparison, but 10, 15 years ago, when I was working on my PhD, it was at least 15 years ago, actually, 15 or 20 years ago. I combed vines and just once, and we had a hard frost. We lost all our shoots. And in our plots, we still, on secondary buds, got an average yield of 4 tons per acre on the varieties we had, because those secondary buds were extremely fruitful, probably because they were combed and the sunlight got into there. Again, maybe that would have happened on uncombed vines too. Again, there was not a side-by-side comparison, but I do believe that in the case of frost damage, combing is going to get sunlight into those secondary buds and make them more fruitful than if you don't. So leaf pulling on a high wire, VSP mid-wire cordon system, to me, it really makes sense there, because the fruit's low in the canopy, and they're already kind of predisposed to shade when it's low in the canopy. And if you have vines trained to a VSP mid-wire cordon type system, to me, that's where leaf pulling makes a lot of sense. If you're in a high wire system, it's trickier, like I mentioned, because of the fact that if the shoots are growing horizontally, you're going to have to pull a crazy amount of leaves to have any impact. And so if you believe that leaf pulling is important, at first implement it on your mid-wire cordon / VSP vines, and then question if it's actually needed on high wire cordon vines. And I kind of have an analogy here about that. So if we look at a grapevine as kind of an analogy of a tree, we need really good exposure on fruit that's low in the canopy. So you can see the little Lego dude on the bottom there. You can see him, but chances are, if you take this vineyard analogy and take it to rows of trees, he's going to be in the shade almost all day long, because in the heat of the day, he's in the shade because the sun's over top. And as the sun starts to set, you got shade from the neighboring vine and so forth. So in my personal opinion, a VSP type training system, we need to see that fruit more than in a high wire system. A high wire system, and I don't know if you saw the little guy poking out on the top right there, he's in the top of the canopy. Regardless of if there's 100% exposure, and we don't want 100% exposure, it's going to be getting sunlight directly on that fruit. So seeing fruit and having sunlight hitting fruit directly are two very different things, in my personal opinion. And that's why I say leaf pulling is more important on VSP trained vines than on high wire cordon trained vines, because that fruit's already behind the canopy. And if we're combing and getting those shoots orientated and up and down, we're already going to get some decent fruit exposure, and we may not need to leaf pull. And I'd even argue that sometimes it's detrimental because of the heat that we get during harvest at some point. We did some leaf pulling and combing and so forth on some vines a number of years ago on Frontenac Blanc, and we saw a lot of just berry shrivel on the vines that we leaf pulled because they had so much more exposure. And I don't think that was a positive thing on those. And so you just got to caution you that, we can't overdo things. And if you're in a high wire cordon system and you leaf pull everything, that fruit is in a very different situation than if you did the same thing when that fruit's low in the canopy, like on a VSP type system. So here's an example of these crescent vines that if you just go on and try and leaf pull that, where do you start and stop? This is basically one shoot growing horizontally, and I'd have to remove all these leaves to have an effect on there, versus here, now that they're combed, again, I haven't done any leaf pulling, any shoot thinning, and these leaves are going to reorientate to some extent and provide a little more cover than they are now in the next few days. But now if I do want to leaf pull, which I'm not saying you have to in these situations, you only have to remove a few for that to actually have an impact. So that's something to think about. High wire cordon vines, I would not leaf pull and do nothing else. I'm not sure that that's worth the time, but I would comb. And if you still are of the belief or the opinion that you need to do some leaf pulling, do on the east side of the vines, north side of the vines, whatever your orientation is, and see if it makes sense. But Again, I don't think we need the level of exposure that you do on a VSP type system just because that fruit's high in the canopy. Moving on to yield estimation, we're hitting that time of year and a lot of different ways to do it. We're not going to go through all of them. The most common way people use in the wine grape world, at least in the Midwest, is just using historical cluster weights. And my personal frustration with that method is every time I've weighed clusters at harvest, they've always been smaller than the averages that I see posted at various sites. Especially if we're not doing shoot thinning, we're removing, weaker shoots that have smaller clusters. Historical cluster weight, there's a lot of factors that go into, what's an average cluster weight. And I just caution the use of that without adjusting it for your own location. There's also literature that says, at veraison, when the lag phase occurs, when the berries are at about 50% of their harvest weight. And again, that seems like a pretty decent idea too. The challenge is, how do you define veraison? Veraison, is it the start of veraison? Is it at 50% color? And a lot of people use the 50% color as that's when veraison is. But veraison is a gradual 3-week process. When in those 3 weeks are you going to do those clusters to see if they're actually at that lag phase? And the lag phase is when the berries are not growing. They're basically kind of stagnant in their growth. And so it's a very stable time to weigh those berries and use some multiplier. Usually you take it ×2 to determine the cluster weight. There's an article from Michigan State and Ohio State about using growing degree days as a better tool to maybe decide when to weigh clusters or berries to determine yield. What I did a few years ago, I got a grant where we did a lot of berry sampling, and I'm going to share that with you here in a little bit. But historical cluster weight, you can put together a spreadsheet like I did here where you don't have to do the calculations and input the numbers every time. And if people want a copy of a spreadsheet, I can send you a copy of this. It's pretty simple. You enter your cluster weight and you can do the math in terms of how many tons per acre you have. The key is you got to know how many vines per acre you have. So any method that's out there relies on you to come up with an accurate cluster weight, and you can get that from a source. You can get that from the method I'm going to describe here in a little bit, but still you need to accurately count the number of clusters per vine and know how many vines you have. And I discourage people from using, well, I planted this many vines, this is how many I have, because quite often we have a number of vines that are unproductive. And same thing with counting clusters per vine. There's movement towards an app being able to use a smartphone to be able to drive through a vineyard and count clusters per vine. My hope was that would be available at this point in time, but it's not available yet. So you still have to go do that. So a lot of people get frustrated with yield estimation because of inaccuracies. And a lot of that's just because you need to make sure you're using a representative sample. You can't just count 3 vines, the clusters on 3 vines, and expect that to represent the whole vineyard. You can't assume that it's the number of vines you planted. You have to have accurate numbers to be able to multiply that by. And so that is on you as the grower to be able to do that in your vineyard. What I was trying to help with is, how do we accurately predict how big these clusters are going to be? And so what we did is, in 6 locations, we tried to sample every 7 to 14 days, berries and clusters. And then what we did is we plotted these based on growing degree days. So when is this, quote, lag phase where the berries aren't growing much, and we can multiply that by a certain number to estimate, what the yield is, or how big these clusters are going to be. And there's a lot of nuances to this. And one thing with Frontenac and this best fit line isn't showing this, but notice that when we harvest down here, the cluster weight actually decreases in Frontenac because we allow it to shrivel some. That's something to think about. A lot of our cold hardy varieties like Frontenac, sometimes the Crescent, the Frontenac family, I should say, we allow some shrivel to occur. Is something we got to factor into yield estimation. So basically what we did is we plotted these and we found, okay, when is this kind of flat line area? And it depended on the cultivar, but basically it was around 1400 growing degrees, depending on the cultivar. And there's a little wiggle room with this. Here's just an example of Frontenac. Did the same thing with Marquette, and you can see around 1400 growing degree days, give or take, That's when that kind of curve flattened, and you would have time to go out there and weigh these clusters and then extrapolate, what the size is going to be. And so I also looked at the color, and again, the rating of 50% and 25% color is pretty subjective, because how do you define when a berry turns color? But I found that this year, that if you had waited till the 50% of the berries had turned color, they were almost at 75% of their final berry size and cluster size. And so waiting till 50% for raisin would not lead to an accurate yield estimation at all. It would lead to a very grossly overstated yield estimation if you took these numbers times 2, like a lot of people do. And so what we found is, at least in Marquette and actually almost all the red varieties we've looked at the very slightest start of color, and this was just 1 year of information, so I would like to do this another couple of years in just one location, so I don't have to travel all over. The intent was to see if this trend is at all locations, which it was. Now we need to kind of hone in the numbers, but you can see this Marquette has just a few colored berries, and that was right here. The year we did this, once we see significant color, we're well past that lag phase, which is kind of that stable time where we like to measure berries to estimate their weight. So what we did is I kind of broke these down into cultivar groups. And so La Crescent was the first one to hit the lag phase at around 1,350 growing degree days. Then the other ones are subsequent. Now, do you exactly have to do it at this exact growing degree days? No. There's some wiggle room in there, but the more wiggle room you give it, the more likely you're going to have an error. The other factor is that multiplying these numbers times 2, in my case, I'm saying dividing it. Like some of our varieties, like Frontenac and Brianna, at the lag phase, they were more than half of their harvested weight. And so if we just double the berry weight, again, it'd lead to a very much inflated yield estimation. So basically, if you look at your growing degree days from April until now, at around 1,400 growing degree days, you're going to catch most of the varieties at their lag phase. Petit Pearl and Foch were a little bit later, and then you can use that to figure out yield. When I look at where we're sitting at growing degree days right now, southern part of the state is at around 1,500 growing degree days, so we're a little past the ideal stage. Central Iowa is right at about the 1,400 growing degree day mark, where we could implement this and see if it works. Northern Iowa, you're going to be knocking on that door in the next couple of days. And so, again, it's a little late for the southern part of the state to give this a try, but it's something to consider, seeing if it works for you to estimate yields. So, like I mentioned, there is a little wiggle room. So Frontenac, we're saying 1,400 growing degree days is when you're supposed to do that. But if you look at 1,500 growing degree days, it's still pretty close. And again, in hindsight, this webinar is a little late coming out to give this a go. But that's hindsight. We had a heat wave last week. So basically what you do, you go out there at the appropriate growing degree days, weigh the clusters. My example, they weighed 0.19 pounds. My example, I'm using Frontenac. So we actually, I have a typo in there, 0.15. So we take the 0.15 divided by 0.56, and we get that the clusters are going to average about that much estimated at harvest. Again, you still need to come up with the average number of clusters per vine and the number of vines per acre and all that kind of stuff to get an accurate yield. There's lots of factors that go into this. If you're looking at Frontenac for rosé, you might be picking it before there's significant berry shrivel, and so you might have to adjust this. La Crescent, if you're machine harvesting it, you might drop 10% of the berries because you're harvesting it later, and so you have a lot of berry shelling. I just caution you, you can come up with a yield estimation number. It's built on a lot of assumptions. The yellow is stuff that, I'm suggesting some ways to try and come up with that. The stuff in blue is what you have to come up with in your yield. And so a lot of factors go into ensuring you have an accurate yield estimation. And another thing to kind of think about, if we're hand harvesting, for harvesting the rakuses and all that kind of stuff and green berries. In machine harvesting, most of the rakuses or cluster stems stay in the vine, and a lot of the green berries do too. And so that might be a 5% difference in yield with those alone. There's an article that I kind of wrote in more detail that has this in there. I'm perfectly willing to help anyone that would like information on this just to see if this works for you. Again, I want to caution you, we track these very intensively for 1 year. You need to spend the time to do it in another year, hopefully 2027. I can do this in a local vineyard perhaps to track them more detail just to see if the trend holds true with those growing degree days. But if you'd like to give that a try to see if that works for you, I encourage you to do that and share with me how it worked for you. Keep in mind that a lot of other factors go into yield estimations, and if they end up being accurate, like bird damage, berry shelling, those types of things. So some of those can't be factored into when you're doing yield estimation. So we'll kind of end this, open up to discussion. My contact info is there. We will open up to discussion. So if people are curious what you're doing for canopy management, again, in low figure vineyards, it may not be necessary.